5.
Without my grandmother, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you about politics.
4.
I'm sure listeners will have seen President Trump on magnificently disdainful form beckoned Sir Keir forward and then lightly brushed him away.
3.
I've many issues with Trump. I often don't agree with him. Aspects of his personality are borderline insane. But you have to tip your hat to the man with the orange hair.
2.
They didn't have any choice. They were on board. It's like one of those Tom Cruise movies where no one can get off the train apart from if it falls off a cliff.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Peace in the Middle East. That's Donald Trump's declaration, and anyone watching the speeches he's made in Jerusalem and Sharm el-Sheikh saw a US president luxuriating in his power. Trump's message was that he had brought arguably the world's most tragically tumultuous region to a historic turning point. All I've done all my life is deals, he said, and maybe this is going to be the greatest deal of them all. Plenty of bien-pensant commentators, programmed to hate Trump, of course, are scoffing. But they must surely recognise the vital role he played in this ceasefire and merciful hostage exchange. Yes, the likes of Qatar, Turkey and Egypt pressured Hamas into accepting this deal, but Trump made it happen. Over recent days, as we've seen the British government trying to claim credit for this Middle East ceasefire before being slapped down by US officialdom, Keir Starmer's administration seems to have further lost grasp of reality. Rachel Reeves is in Washington, referring to the UK, set for the lowest per capita GDP growth in the G7 and with easily the highest inflation, as a beacon of economic stability. Saying things doesn't make them true, Chancellor. Financial markets continue to charge the UK government more to borrow than any other major economy, more than those past paragons of fiscal virtue, Italy, Spain and Greece. There are some astonishing opinion polls doing the round, co-pilot, including one showing the Tories winning 7 seats at the next general election, with Labour on just 72 and Nigel Farage's Reform UK upstarts on a jaw-dropping 445 out of 650 common seats, a monster-sized majority. What say you, co-pilot? Is Farage heading for number 10?
Oh, goodness, it's a bumper week this week, isn't it? History has been made. I think, that is a pretty astonishing poll of polls, a super poll, isn't it? But I think we've got to lodge the caveat that poll giving Reform the biggest landslide in British history was taken before the party conferences. So if there is indeed a potential Kemi bounce, we'll talk about the Tory leader a bit later, but I think we both agree that she did a really good speech. So it may be that poll is potentially a bit of an outlier, but still pretty jaw-dropping.
But Allison, as you know, it's a multi-level regression and post-stratification poll. And you can explain to us what that is as Planet Normal's resident statistician.
You've got back for your economics lecturing train journey.
They loved me.
They didn't have any choice. They were on board. It's like one of those Tom Cruise movies where no one can get off the train apart from if it falls off a cliff. No, I don't know what it is, but I think we are certainly seeing a moment where, everyone you speak to pretty much thinks the country's gone to the dogs and something has got to be done. So I think that's where we are. We're also seeing Liam Sir Keir Starmer in the dotage of his absolutely clueless, catastrophic premiership, where pretty much everything that Labour comes up with now is let's try and keep Keir in office. It's an entirely delusional and defensive thing. And as you say, actually, one of the many high points this week, because we had the astonishing handover of the hostages, 20 young men. I've been very involved, Liam, with all hostage families, hostage friends and relatives and so on. So it's been an extraordinary week for me, being privileged to have access to a lot of the information as they were being released. But our Prime Minister, having absolutely insanely and monstrously a few weeks ago recognised the state of Palestine, went scuttling off quickly to Sharm el-Sheikh to try and get in the leader's photo and make himself look relevant rather than the outcast he is. And I'm sure listeners will have seen President Trump on magnificently disdainful form beckoned Sir Keir forward and then lightly brushed him away. But yeah, I mean, I think we have emerged from this astonishing historic moment of a ceasefire and complete realignment of hopefully the hopes for the Middle East of Britain being a bit of a pariah. We actually had Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, saying that the decision of UK and France to recognise the Palestinian state at a key moment in the negotiations with Hamas was extremely damaging. From that point of view, it's very bad news for us. And in every direction you look, really, we've really angered Israel. And I think I said to you, I sat next to, a couple of weekends ago, former head of Mossad, the amazing Yossi Cohen, who essentially said to me, Liam, that Mossad had been giving the UK a huge number of tip-offs about likely Islamist attacks. So whether they'll be sufficiently generous with us going forward is another issue. But Trump triumphant, Liam, and rightly so.
Can I just say, Allison, how moved I was by your interview with Eli Sharabi last week? It was exactly the right decision, I think, by us on Planet Normal, our production team, to devote the whole of Planet Normal to that really astonishing interview where you talked about his incredible loss, the tragedy of his family, and also the defiance that sustained him during his 491 days in captivity.
Yeah.
I think anyone of any view should listen to that interview just for the degree of humanity that's in there and suffering and strength under pressure. So when I was away with a company called Golden Eagle Luxury Trains. I was going around various cities on what you'd call the old Silk Road. It's now the new Silk Road, as it were, from China to Europe. Places like Nukus, places like Samarkand, Almaty in Kazakhstan, Dushanbe in Tajikistan. And we can talk about that, this week or other weeks. A lot of thoughts about what's going on in what used to be called Russia's backyard, now very much increasingly China dominated as a source of natural resources, but also as a kind of corridor from China to Europe, with China reluctant to use sea routes, given the possibility of US naval clashes, reluctant to use northern routes by train across Russia because of sanctions. It's really, really fascinating. But all that's an aside, because I wanted to say a large number of people on that train remarked to me just how incredible they thought that interview was. And of course, many of them were Planet Normal fans. So I just wanted to say all that to you. Your work, I think our work, does have resonance. It does have an audience, not just in the UK, but around the world. And that was really brought home to me over the last couple of weeks while I've been away. When it comes to the Middle East, it really is interesting, sort of zoologically interesting, watching various commentators who, their whole lifestyle choice is to hate Trump, having to deal with the fact that he's actually done something pretty incredible here. Who knows? It may not hold. It's not like doing a real estate deal where the principals do the deal, then they leave it to the architects and the plumbers and the lawyers to work out the details going down the track. It's like doing a real estate deal and then in the middle of the build, there's another earthquake and another earthquake. Because, of course, this is a very tumultuous region and there will be many, many bumps along the road. But the prerequisite of some kind of stability is a ceasefire, and a prerequisite of some kind of return to space for negotiation is a hostage exchange. The first step is so often the hardest, and you have to hand it to Donald Trump for all his personality traits, for all his ridiculous hyperbole, for all his kind of dead cat negotiating strategy. You're there negotiating with somebody and suddenly you whip out a dead cat and bang it on the table and what's going on? These are what made him the New York real estate mogul that he was and is. And it is very unconventional diplomacy. It does put the noses out of joint of, the various Jonathans and Nigels who have been trying to do deals in the Middle East for years and utterly failed. He has wielded US hegemony to the extent it still exists and military might in a way that shows humanity. You have to wish him well. I mean, if you don't wish him well, if you let the aesthetics of his personality outweigh the progress that's been made on a humanitarian gauge, if you like, by what's happened in the last 48 to 72 hours, then you're just a poser, in my view. You're not a serious commentator, you're not a serious observer if you let your personal distaste and mood music outweigh what should be a celebratory response to what's actually happened. I'm not saying it's peace in the Middle East forever. Of course it isn't. You know, the Oslo Accords went much deeper than this. But after a period of tremendous suffering, of tremendous human carnage, so brilliantly captured in your interview last week, you know, suffering on both sides, let it be said, to have this ceasefire and specifically to have major Arab powers now helping him make this ceasefire, that is new. That's a complete change. That wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without the Abraham Accords, for which he gets almost no credit, which of course are a much lower wattage kind of business accord, if you like, between, you know, very, very smart people in Israel, very, very smart people in UAE and elsewhere, often young entrepreneurs working together to bring prosperity, joint prosperity to the region. I don't think without that outreach work he's been doing for many years on the business side, this sort of heavy lifting diplomatic deal making could have happened. So, you know, like you, Allison, I have many issues with Trump. I often don't agree with him. Aspects of his personality are borderline insane. But you have to tip your hat to the man with the orange hair. You just have to.
Well, I love his sort of, as an aside, truth-telling, which are, you know, very few leaders would ever do that. So you're right, Liam, in addition to the Abraham Accords and him managing to corral Saudi and the various Arab countries to come in on this deal, I think the most notable thing really is the friend bullying of Netanyahu, because I think it was pretty clear that Netanyahu would have been rather happy for the war to go on for some considerable time, given that he's facing corruption charges, and there's going to be a very, very unpleasant inquiry into what went wrong on the 7th of October 2023, the minute the war's over. So he was trying to forestall that, and Trump, in his absolutely brilliant, bombastic way, basically turned to Netanyahu in the Knesset and said, you know, you really didn't want this thing to go on for another 3 or 4 years. So he's exerted some huge power over Israel there, including getting Bibi to ring up Qatar and apologise. This is extraordinary power play. One thing I should say, Liam, is that this whole week has cast the whole conflict, I think, in a new light. And with the hostages coming out and these appalling stories of degradation, torture. In fact, 2 people I know of quite well were Ziv and Gali Berman. They are twins who lived on the Kfar Aza kibbutz I visited. And Ziv lived opposite Emily Damari, who was the British hostage, who was also taken prisoner by Hamas. And in fact, on that horrible morning, Emily texted Ziv to come over to her little bungalow that I visited. And he did indeed go to help his great friend. And the twins, they're both in their late 20s, Liam, Ziv and Gali, they were kept in solitary confinement. The boys didn't know the other one was alive, if you can believe that. So being kept in absolutely hellish conditions. And they've come out. We've heard from Emily's family that she now feels that she can start her healing process. She didn't feel she could while her beloved friends were still in captivity. But this has shone a light, Liam, really on the motives, hasn't it? So we are still seeing these pro-Palestine demonstrations, which are just furious displays, to my mind, of Jew hate. And so they've been calling, haven't they, for a ceasefire. And now we've got a Trump ceasefire. Oh, they don't want that kind of ceasefire. They want their version of a ceasefire. So massive hypocrisy and wrong-headedness. But also, I would say that we are now seeing Hamas, which has been brilliant at propaganda during this period, spewing out absolute nonsense, outrageous nonsense about genocide, starvation, and so on, now revealed for the lies, the absolute lies it always was. And what we are seeing in the last couple of days, Liam, is Hamas in its true colours on the streets of Gaza, executing, making men kneel down in the dust and shooting them through the head. So that's what's going on now. And those men we see on the TV executing people in public, that's the state that our country has recognised. So that's how bad it is. And it was very interesting. Yesterday, that Trump essentially said, because they've released the 20 living hostages, they've released 4 bodies of the dead hostages. I think there are 24 more dead hostages to be released. And Trump has basically said, if you don't do this, you're dead. That's it. I mean, I've never seen him. Actually, he was very, very, very angry. So, yeah, just to sum up, I think this is now revealing Israel and Hamas in a wholly other light. And we've actually had the joy of people like the BBC, who I think have been useful idiots for Hamas, are now pulling very, very bitter, sour faces, Liam.
I think it's interesting, Alison, off the back of what you've just said, the young Oxford student who, I'm not even going to say the chant, it's so disgusting.
It is disgusting.
What a moron. What an absolute moron. He's now been arrested. The Telegraph is reporting as we speak. He's 20 years old. What a waste of a world-class education. That's all I can say. I think they should have suspended the Oxford Union president who luxuriated in the murder of Charlie Kirk.
Yes.
And I said that to quite a lot of people very high up at what is one of my old universities, and was looked at, eyes blinking, as if I was insane. I don't think I'm insane. I think it gets to the point where people are adults, and if they do really, really stupid things, then they should face some serious consequences. Pour encourager les autres, if you want. I do think, though, the shot of the week, if you want, the kind of video media image of the week, wasn't that idiotic young man chanting that nonsense. It was, as you say, Donald Trump literally inviting Keir Starmer to the podium in front of the world's president and then sort of turning his back on him and pushing him away. It was incredible to watch, and Starmer's face. And I do wonder now how Starmer's government is going to respond to the US president in light of what's been going on in the Middle East, given the importance of the US relationship to the UK, still by far our biggest single country trading partner, and of course our most important military ally. You know, spending a couple of weeks, as I did, in Central Asia, talking to lots of people very much engaged in the region, it did really remind me how important geopolitics is. The great game is ongoing. There's a big clash of civilizations and powers going on. And yet there's the UK, you know, engaging in sort of student politics, not just student politics with idiotic undergrads, but student politics at the top level of government as well. And Starmer does have to kind of get hold of this and start making overtures to the US, because a lot of the world is very much going to salute what Donald Trump has done. I'm not saying it's peace in the Middle East forever. Of course it isn't. There will be many, many bumps in the road, but they have to start giving him some kind of credit, however much they hate him.
Yes, but I don't think that's possible, you see, because I think where Starmer is now is trapped in student politics by definition, because the people he's trying to curry favour with are his left. And they are, as I said, by definition, they are the ones chanting those ridiculous chants about Zionists and so on. But everywhere we look, Liam, Starmer is not capable of doing anything for the British people. We're still waiting for the start of the National Rape Gang inquiry. Where's that? Kicked down the road.
And Rupert Lowe's done good work exposing that lack of action, hasn't he? You have to hand it to him.
Absolutely. So, you know, obviously they're trying to kick the can down the road, because then they'll hope that the findings, such as they'll be, will come after the next general election. We've got absolutely horrendous numbers of illegal migrants coming ashore. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, is admitting this week that the state has lost control of our borders. And their only answer is this pathetic, barely a sticking plaster. It's a sort of Paddington Bear sticking plaster, which is the, you know,
it's a marmalade sandwich of a solution.
It's a marmalade sandwich of a solution. 1 in, 1 out. No, 17 in, 17. I mean, absolutely farcical. She is starting to look at perhaps deporting some of them. You know, they remember how critical Labour was of the Tories' Rwanda scheme, but now they're talking about perhaps paying Kosovo to take some of these people. So in addition to all this, you know, the Save Keir's skin, we've got this ongoing, really huge potential scandal of the alleged spies, 2 young Brits who, of course, deny spying, but for China, but they were on trial, and then the trial has collapsed because it looks very like the British government would rather that alleged spies were allowed to go free than cause themselves any embarrassment with China. I mean, this is really terrible stuff, Liam. And I should say that in a week when we had a lovely dinner, didn't we, on Monday, we went to the Guildhall in London for a splendid dinner marking the 100th birthday of Margaret Thatcher. And quite understandably, you know, we were given to reflecting on what the Iron Lady had meant and goes on meaning. And I thought how many of her achievements, particularly the economic achievements, have been squandered or unpicked. But it is impossible to think of Margaret Thatcher giving any house room to alleged spies against British MPs, hoping that some foreign power that the Labour government refuses to call enemy would be bought off. So what a moral pit we're in, Liam. Really, really, I think absolutely shameful.
This is a really complicated one, Allison. We're obviously not in full conflict with China. On the contrary, thousands of Chinese kids, the sons and daughters of their elite, are here in the UK at top schools and at universities. China continues to buy an awful lot of UK government debt. China continues to own our steelworks and some of our major car manufacturers. The Chinese own the only gigafactory in Britain making the batteries that are so vital to the electric vehicle revolution. And yet at the same time, there are acts going on. There are brushes between the US Navy and China in the South China Sea. There have been more air incursions over Taiwan this year than any previous year. Those have escalated in the last few years. The Chinese premier is saying quite often now that the one China policy is going to happen, which is basically code for some kind of blockade or takeover of Taiwan, which in turn produces, most of the advanced semiconductors that the world uses. They are literally the oil and gas de nos jours, massively important in driving manufacturing and economic growth across the Western world. So we're in a kind of cold war, if you like, with China, in the sense that we're pretending everything's fine, but it's obviously not fine. And Jonathan Powell, again, he will deny wrongdoing. He was trying to not explicitly say that China is our enemy, which of course meant that the prosecution's case against these British people who are accused of spying, again, they would deny wrongdoing, collapses. It's a really, really difficult conundrum. It's the kind of the dark arts of statecraft that the people involved desperately hope don't see the light of day. But so often these days, they do see the light of day. I think a lot of these issues, Allison, quite soon are just going to be absolutely blown away by economic imperatives. And what do I mean by economic imperatives? I mean inflation rates. I mean government borrowing costs. Yes, I'm a scratch record on this stuff, but a lot of what we've been saying on Planet Normal in recent months is now mainstream. It is now coming to the fore. Rachel Reeves' fiscal situation, where she's driven the UK economy, there is now endless clarion calls telling her, if you raise taxes more, you are going to crush growth even more. It's very, very simple. And yet ideologically, she's hemmed in by the Labour left that you mentioned, because she cannot countenance any kind of reining in spending increases, let alone actual spending cuts, in order to try and make the public finances add up. And when you're in that kind of situation, you become even more dependent on overseas creditors, overseas governments lending you money, not least the likes of China and so on. So it's been a tremendously fast-moving week in terms of news. It's been largely about the Middle East, the spy row that you've been discussing. But I think pretty soon, and in the run-up to the budget on November 26, I think the economy is going to move very much to the fore, and it's going to stay there for months to come.
I saw actually, Liam, that the economy had overtaken immigration just narrowly now in public concern. And we've touched on Planet Normal, haven't we, about the absolutely terrifying increase in the cost of living. We've been having lots of emails about that. I have to say, I have to hand it to Rachel from accounts, who apparently is going to try and blame her own grotesque ineptitude on Brexit. Because, of course, slapping taxes on businesses and making it much harder for businesses to employ people while jacking up green taxes that mean businesses can't afford to turn on the electricity because we've got the most expensive electricity in the developed world. But no, Halligan, Brexit is to blame.
Now, it's 100 years this week since the birth of Margaret Thatcher, the UK's first female Prime Minister, of course. A 3 times election winner, she redefined the Conservative Party and in many ways the political and economic landscape of the UK, as well as playing a key role in ending the Cold War. Thatcher's legacy is divisive, but even her staunchest critics can't honestly deny her massive influence. She's widely seen as the UK's greatest Prime Minister since Churchill. Now, Iain Dale is best known as a long-established broadcaster on LBC Radio, but he's also very much a man of letters, the author and editor of countless books, and his latest is a biography of Margaret Thatcher, timed to coincide with this week's anniversary. While Charles Moore's official biography is the definitive work, Iain's book is deliberately more concise, designed to introduce this political colossus to a younger generation, those who weren't around during her term in office, 1979 to 1990. Iain's been a Tory party member for many years. He's held several advisory roles in the party. He knew Margaret Thatcher personally, and his biography, I would say, is broadly admiring, but willing to criticise when criticism is due. I started by asking Iain Dale why he wrote this book, given that so much has already been written about Margaret Thatcher.
It's a really good question because, first of all, when the publishers approached me, I said no, because I thought, what can I add to the sum of human knowledge about Margaret Thatcher that Charles Moore hasn't already written? I then broke my hip, and as part of the rehab, I had to go to get a personal trainer. I know that sounds really weird, but anyway, I did. And he was 25 years old, called Aaron, at Tunbridge Wells Nuffield Gym. And when he found out what I did for a living, he said, now, Margaret Thatcher, I've sort of heard of her, but what did she do? And I was thinking, oh my God, he's only barely heard of her. So I've essentially written it for younger generations. So when I go and do literary festivals, I always start by saying, now, I hope you'll all buy the book at the end, but don't buy it for yourself. Buy it for your children and your grandchildren. Because if you think about it, Liam, it's 35 years since she left office. Yeah. So at least 2 generations have grown up really, I mean, with no direct experience. You have to be 56 years old to have voted for her in 1987. So it's really just aimed at people who want to get an introduction to her. It's not a long book. It's only 170 pages. And I've tried to write it in a reasonably sort of chatty way without it being seen as a dumbed down version of a biography. And so far, it seems to have gone down really well, exactly with that cohort of people that I was aiming it at.
I think everyone knows you're encyclopedic when it comes to politics, but I read this book pretty much in one sitting, and it is a masterpiece, I would say, of compression and readability. And as you say in your introduction, it's a lot harder to write a short book than to write a long book.
Well, it really is. And the other thing, I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with 2 17-year-olds. And when we'd finished recording, I asked them what they'd thought about Margaret Thatcher before the interview. And they both said that they were taught in school that she was evil. Yeah. You'll have seen the chapter at the end about 12 myths. Yeah. I could have probably done about 50. But I've tried to explode some of the myths that have grown up about her over the last 35 years.
What are your memories of her becoming leader of the opposition in 1975? You were a schoolboy in northwest rural Essex, though you were politically pretty engaged for a schoolboy. I was just about sentient then. I was 6. It was a big deal when suddenly we had a female leader of the opposition, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was 12. I remember the exact moment when I found out that she'd become leader. It was February the 11th, 1975. I was watching the BBC News at 6, and I remember running up the stairs. My grandmother was in bed, and I told her that Margaret Thatcher had been elected leader of the Conservative Party, and she burst into tears, which I thought was distinctly odd at the time. She explained to me later that it was because she never thought she would live to see a woman lead a British political party. She was a woman who was born in 1894. She was the first woman in her family to effectively break out of the village that she grew up in. She went to London to work for the GPO and then worked at Wembley Stadium when it first opened in 1923. Oh. I'm not saying she was a feminist, but she knew that women had a bit of a bigger role to play in life than just staying at home and looking after kids. So it meant a lot to her. And she lived to see Margaret Thatcher become Prime Minister, but only by a few months. Margaret Thatcher was very influenced by her maternal grandmother, who lived with the Roberts family until Margaret was 10.
In Grantham in Lincolnshire.
And I think she had the same effect on her that my grandmother had on me. Without my grandmother, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you about politics, because she was the one that radicalised me, I suppose.
And of course, the UK that you and I grew up in, it was really dominated by industrial relations. We both remember well the winter of discontent in 78, 79, on the back of which Margaret Thatcher really won power. I remember delivering papers in 1979. I remember delivering the Express on May the 3rd. Maggie all the way was the headline. It was a big deal when she came into office, but there was a sense, wasn't there, of we need some grown-ups in this country because it's just not working.
Wasn't it ever thus, Liam? I don't know about you, but my overwhelming feeling in the latter part of the 1970s was there must be something better than this.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it was until I sort of learnt about Margaret Thatcher, but I just instinctively knew that the country was going to the dogs. I remember going on a school exchange to Germany in 1977, and we were laughed at.
Yeah.
We were the sick man of Europe because of the strikes. And the dead were left unburied because of gravediggers' strikes. It had really got to that point, and rubbish was building up in Leicester Square because it wasn't being collected, and rats were running rife, a bit like Birmingham today, I suppose. And you get to the point where you just sort of throw up your hands in despair and want something different. Now, at that point, I mean, it was two-party politics. The Liberals had flattered to deceive in 1974, but after the Jeremy Thorpe trial, they were kind of out of the game. So you had the Conservative and Labour Party, which up to that point had been seen as, like people say now, the uniparty. There was a consensus about managing the decline of Britain. Well, Margaret Thatcher just decided that she was going to be different and not accept that so-called Butsker-like consensus, the consensus where the Conservatives effectively agreed with most of Labour's economic policy.
Rab Butler and Hugh Gateskill, yeah.
Exactly. She just sort of rammed through that and thought, no, this is not going to be. Now, she wasn't a Thatcherite, as we would now call it in 1975. She was a magpie. She stole policies from the think tanks and individuals. And Thatcherism as such, I don't really think came into existence probably until late in her first term, early in her second term.
And of course, we're conducting this conversation to mark the 100th anniversary of her birth, but also we're both very keen students of contemporary politics. I'm interested in your thoughts on the parallels, and we'll come to that with the current Tory leadership. But as you say, when she came into office even, she wasn't a Thatcherite. There was no mention of privatisation in the 1979 manifesto, or monetarism as it came to be seen, a completely brand new way of thinking about macroeconomics, bearing down on inflation rather than thinking that government spending is the be-all and end-all. In some ways, Iain Dale, she kind of made it up as she went along, didn't she?
Yes, she didn't have an ideological grounding, which again goes against the countervailing sort of narrative that she was extremely ideological. She may have got ideological towards the end of her time, but she certainly wasn't at the beginning. And Keith Joseph had a big influence on her because he was the sole voice in the Heath cabinet that was really arguing for a different way. Yeah. And Heath made a great mistake because he allowed Thatcher and Joseph to form the Centre for Policy Studies, which ever since 1974, when it was formed, has really been in the vanguard of Conservative policy making. Now, Keith Joseph was seen as the most likely person to challenge Ted Heath, but he made a very ill-judged speech on basically eugenics. I mean, you can call it that, as a sort of social class, saying that basically working class people were breeding too much. And you can imagine the outcry from that was huge.
Got dubbed a mad monk for his trouble.
Yeah, and he was always a bit of a fragile personality, and he just decided that he wasn't made for leadership. And when he told her that he wouldn't be challenging Ted Heath, and she just said, well, if you won't, I will. And it was seen as a mission of madness in many ways, because she wasn't popular. She hadn't been a great education secretary in the Heath cabinet, but she was seen as having the balls to challenge Heath. And that's why she beat him in the first ballot. So he was out. All these other Tories came into the second ballot, but she whipped them as well. And there was a lot of buyer's remorse. I mean, there are so many analogies to Kemi Badenoch's situation today. When I was writing the chapter on her time as leader of the opposition, I texted Kemi, and this was just before she became leader, and I said, you really need to bone up on Thatcher's period in opposition, because every 200 or 300 words every 200 or 300 words I was writing, I thought, this is Kemi. And it was funny, about a month after she became leader, she sent me a screenshot of a page from another Thatcher biography about the period in opposition, and she circled a paragraph and she just scrawled on it, "This is my life." And okay, there are many differences. I mean, Thatcher didn't have to cope with 24-hour news media, social media. She just did sort of 5 or 6 big interviews in a year, and that was it. If Kemi doesn't say something every single day, she's accused of being lazy. So there is much to learn for her from the Thatcher period of opposition.
How much responsibility does she bear for the social divisions, for the regional disparities, which really opened up then? We remember deindustrialization. We remember all those strikes. We remember, and we know to this day that she is quite literally reviled in some parts of the north of England. Was that her fault?
Up to a point, I think it actually was, because she knew that there was going to be a conflict with the miners. Having lived through the early 1970s, where the National Union of Miners effectively brought down the Heath government, she was determined they wouldn't do that to her. Now, when Arthur Scargill replaced the more moderate Joe Gormley, she knew that conflict was inevitable. So right from the start, she asked her energy secretaries, David Howell and Nigel Lawson, to plan for a coal strike. It wasn't that she was provoking one, but she knew it would come. So planning for one was a sensible thing to do.
Stockpiling coal, so the unions had less power.
Absolutely. And Nigel Lawson was a key figure in that. And when Arthur Scargill did call a strike in March 1984, they were ready. I mean, it's stupid timing to call a coal strike in the spring. But he had to do it then, because he knew that if he waited till the autumn, the latest Trade Union Act would be in force, and that would mean he'd have had to have a strike ballot. And in March, that legislation hadn't come into force yet. It was a vicious strike. It lasted for a year, and she had to prevail. If she hadn't prevailed, we really would have gone back to the days of the early 1970s. It was vicious on the picket lines, on both sides, it has to be said. She effectively formed a national police force, which had never been done in this country before, in order to police the picket lines. And it created massive social divisions. But let's remember, Harold Wilson closed more mines than Margaret Thatcher did. You mentioned deindustrialisation. That wasn't deliberate, but it was something that was inevitable, because most of the industries that had effectively closed down during the 1980s, they should have closed down during the 1970s, but Labour always bailed them out. But they were failing industries, they were inefficient, they were loss-making, and in the end, the taxpayer couldn't go on supporting them. But what she didn't do enough of was plan for that and try to mitigate the real hardships that people suffered in individual communities. So, for example, in many former mining communities, every single male of working age would have worked down the mine, and then suddenly there was no work. Now, that should have been foreseen. Now, they did try to take some mitigating action, but they didn't go far enough.
That was many years in the making, wasn't it? The so-called Butskillite consensus of bailing out. Yeah, these are the phrases of our youth watching the news, aren't they? The lame duck industries, as they were called, which were massively over-unionized, many, many days lost to strike action. And I think there's a sense, looking back, I think fair-minded people, as you say, would acknowledge that the inevitability that the UK couldn't go on like this. Of course, before we come to contemporary politics, foreign policy, she was massive. I think your book is excellent, the way it talks about how she shaped the end of the Cold War, that incredible relationship she had with Ronald Reagan. She was the one that spotted Gorbachev and brought him to the world's attention, and really, in some senses, laid the ground for a thawing of that Cold War, which, of course, dominated our youth.
Yes, it did. And I think, again, Thatcher haters tried to minimise her contribution to the end of the Cold War. But you're right, she identified Gorbachev. She, how shall I put it, guided Ronald Reagan in many ways. But that relationship, again, wasn't quite what people think. People think that it was close all the time, but there was quite a few fraught moments between her and Reagan.
Grenada, you say?
Well, the invasion of Grenada, there's a magnificent anecdote on that, where America had invaded a territory where the Queen was head of state without actually telling either the Queen or Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
And I mean, they did it for reasonable reasons. They wanted to rescue American citizens. There'd been a sort of far left coup there. And anyway, when Margaret Thatcher found out about it, she was furious because he hadn't told her. So she rang him up, and he was in the middle of a cabinet meeting, and she ranted down the phone to him. And I mean ranted. I mean, literally screaming. And he just held the phone up so all the cabinet could hear and just said, "Isn't she magnificent?" And their relationship went into the deep freeze for about 9 months after that. But she was integral to the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship, because whenever those two would meet or even have a conversation, both of them would ring her up and say, "What do you think the other one's going to say?"
And you reminded me in your book, Iain, that Reagan was, of course, not a unilateralist by any means, but he wanted a much faster pace of nuclear disarmament than she did. She warned him against that. Obviously, there was some. That was what Reykjavik was about and subsequently. But he really bowed to her view on that, didn't he?
Well, she was horrified by what he was planning. I mean, she didn't even know that he was planning to do it, nor did anyone, nor did people in his own administration. And he just went and blurted it out. Now, Gorbachev didn't rise to it. Yeah, that was another fraught moment in the relationship between the two. I mean, she absolutely believed in multilateral disarmament, but she knew if you show the Soviets any kind of weakness, they would capitalize on it.
So what are the lessons for today's Conservative leader, Iain?
Well, I think one thing that you and I probably learned as we advance in years is that nothing is forever. And we thought that there would never be a left-wing Labour Party again. Then Corbyn came along 30 or 40 years later. We thought that inflation had been beaten. Well, we now know it hasn't, although it is hilarious when people get really worried about 3.8% inflation now, where we experienced 25% inflation. We thought unemployment would never go up. Well, it's gone up, I think, every month now. I mean, the day we're recording this, again, it's gone up. So there are all sorts of lessons that nothing is forever. You cannot say that something has been beaten because it will probably come back again. So all politics, all economics are cyclical. But I think the thing that Kemi Badenoch needs to try, she needs time. And the problem is the Conservative Party is so used to regicide that I'm not sure that it will give her the time that she needs to turn things around. I think she's got the ideas to do it. We saw that in her conference speech where she restated Conservative values. And that's something she's got to do. Convince the people that Conservative values are still relevant to a modern day economy and society. And that's not going to be easy because we live in an era where everything is about the soundbite. Nothing is about hour-long speeches on Conservative values. We need to, and this is not just her, but this is the whole Conservative movement and particularly the think tanks. They all need to restate the case for capitalism and free markets because apart from you, no one else is. I'm really being serious on that because in the 1970s, you had the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, Aims of Industry, people who are actually going out there eulogizing about what free markets can do for the economy. No one is doing that at the moment. And you have a whole generation of people who've grown up to get to their 20s and 30s and they haven't got a hope of owning their own home because they cannot accumulate the capital for a deposit. Now, if you cannot accumulate capital, why would you not question capitalism?
Yeah, which, of course, is what is happening. And what do you think Margaret Thatcher now, were she here, what would she say to Kemi Badenoch? How do you think she'd advise her, Iain? What is a pivotal moment for the leader of the opposition?
I think it is all about economic policy. And I think she had this phrase which she would repeat time and time again about sound money. Well, if ever that were relevant, it is today. And I don't think Kemi Badenoch needs to be taught about that. I think we saw in her conference speech that she absolutely believes in that fundamental principle. And I think people respect politicians who stand by their principles. And I mean, I can't think of anything in particular in Kemi's relatively short political career that she's had to row back on. I think you never go with the tide. There's all sorts of little clips of Margaret Thatcher going around Facebook and Instagram at the moment where she talks about her father teaching her never to go with the crowd, always stand by your own principles and eventually you will prevail. And I think she's got to be careful not to be seduced by some of the more populist approach that Nigel Farage and Reform are taking, because you can't ape Nigel Farage, you can't ape another political party, and if you do, you're destined to fail. I think Kemi understands that.
Iain Dale, thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Enjoyed it.
So there you have it, Allison. Iain Dale on Margaret Thatcher. Writing a short book's always tougher than writing a longer one, as Iain so rightly said. And his book, Margaret Thatcher in the Prime Minister series, published by Swift in all good bookshops now.
Iain alluded to it, but Charles Moore's masterly multi-volume biography of Margaret Thatcher, there is now, for the 100th birthday, there is an abridged volume, which I've just read again with great pleasure. So if you actually want to have that as a kind of companion volume, it is absolutely matchless. I went on a great journey with Thatcher, Liam, from being a student when she was when she was first elected and, Maggie, out, when I was in my sort of dungarees and cyclists against the bomb badge phase.
Not those national health glasses held together by sellotape. Those ones.
You've seen them, haven't you?
I have. The ones in the display cabinet in your downstairs loo.
In a fetching shade of pale blue. God, I was hot, Halligan. My goodness me. Yeah, so I despised her, really. And it took me a number of years, I think, to really get the measure and to come to really appreciate the enormity of her achievement, coming from brought up above a corner grocer's shop to being leader of the most powerful political party and, by common consent now, the greatest prime minister of the last 50 years. And of course, we have thought the last few days, I guess, this week of the birthday of what would Margaret Thatcher make of her beloved party? Because above all, she was extremely loyal, Liam, not just loyal to the country, because she had duty written through her like a stick of rock, really, but loyal to the Conservative Party. And Mark Thatcher, her son, was at this event we were at on Monday, special dinner, and he did say that she would have had a lot of sympathy with Nigel Farage and particularly the views on immigration. I found a quote, Liam, which is fascinating, which was Thatcher's speech where she said, "Not one migrant in while there are British people without work." And that really, for me, that sums her up, Britain first. And we have to say, you wrote your economics agenda column this week praising Kemi Badenoch, and what we both agree was an excellent speech at the Conservative Party conference.
I did. I wrote it from a siding in Tashkent. I wasn't at the party conferences this year. Of course, you and I went to Reform before I left, where we interviewed Lucy Connolly, of course. But I generally go to all the main party conferences as a journalist, and I wasn't at the Tories this year. But I did feel that her speech resonated. And, I've been writing for a while and saying to Kemi personally as well for quite a while that the danger of her saying too little is outweighing the danger of her saying too much. I do think she's waited too long before unveiling a few policies. I know why she's waited. She's waited because she's very much an analytical person and she wanted to do a lot of background policy work. But sometimes in life, you don't have the luxury of time on your side. And I don't think she's got time on her side. I think, I know that a lot of the parliamentary party, unfortunately, it brings me no pleasure to say this, I think they're making a mistake, are gunning for her. We're coming up to the first year anniversary of her taking office, after which she can be challenged. They only need 30% of the parliamentary party. That's 30% of 121 MPs. That's quite a small gathering in order to force another vote. I think a lot of the policies she outlined in her speech, abolishing stamp duty, for instance, on principal residences, really stiffening up her message, her and Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, on fiscal rectitude, standing up for fiscal reality. I do think there's a political marketplace for that. Whatever you think, watching the BBC and so on, you think, no one in the country actually is interested in some kind of fiscal responsibility. Well, read the latest social attitude survey. The latest social attitude survey show that there's an awful lot of grown-ups there that know we're living beyond our means and know it's going to end in ruin unless the grown-ups in the room get hold of it. So I do think she's positioned the party a lot better now. I do think she's silenced her internal critics for a while. I don't think they're going to move now before Christmas, and perhaps before conference they may have done. But for her, the big, as you've been saying for many months, as we've been discussing on Planet Normal, the big looming storm cloud on the horizon is in May 2026, when you've got those Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly elections, a lot of by-elections too. Unless something really changes, the Tories do look as if they're going to get absolutely hammered. But at least between now and then, she may be able to, across the opinion polls, harness a bit more support for the Tories. They're down at sort of 16, 17% on most polls these days. Of course, we talked about that super poll at the top, which they're absolutely nowhere. Unless she starts tracking back in the polls, there's going to be endless chatter between now and those May elections about her leadership. But at least for now, she's put down some markers. She said some proper conservative things, as conservative oppositions should be doing. And I do think there's some more respect for her within her own party because she's done that.
I agree, but I think that, Kemi Badenoch is not the problem. The problem is the people who are whispering, oh, we wouldn't want to, abandon the net zero commitment. Oh, it would be bad form to leave the ECHR. There are still too many of those, Liam, in her party.
I agree.
She is being undermined. She's absolutely on the right track. And I just want to finish by saying that Starmer yesterday, Tuesday, gave his usual sanctimonious nonsense statement about the ceasefire in the Middle East. And I think that some leaders would everyone thought be poor form to stand up and you're supposed to just make polite, enthusiastic noises. Haven't we done well? Not a bit of it. Kemi absolutely demolished him. And he accused her of not being statesperson-like. The fact he can even use the word statesperson-like tells you what an absolute wally he is. But she said he was humiliated. He'd recognised the state of Palestine at a point of, maximum danger to the deal, which he was now trying to claim he'd played a key part of. She was absolutely fantastic, and all credit to her, because her moral centeredness and the things we admire her for, like truth telling, being correct on the culture, being correct on the Islamist threat. We've seen what Israel's done to the Islamist threat in Gaza. And Kemi Badenoch rightly saying, let's see some of that resolve and courage about the Islamist threat in our own country. So all credit to her. And I think if they come for her, the old timid, cleverly lot come for her.
The Tim's nice but dims.
Yes, Tim's nice but dims. And she's, she's not dim and she is nice, but she's not, she's brave.
Yeah.
And if they come for her and they think that that's going to solve their problem. The problem is nobody trusts the Conservatives, right? She's been handed a brand at its absolute nadir, and it's really difficult. But certainly she's had a much better week, and well done her. She really lifted my heart attacking Starmer yesterday. Absolutely great.
Now on to our listener emails, the messages you send to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
We've had lots of lovely reaction, Liam, to the Ellie Sharabi interview. I think Ellie's almost sort of Buddha-like calm really resonated with people. David said, I've just listened to Allison's heartbreaking interview with Ellie Sharabi. It must have been hard for her to ask him about the terrible suffering he had been through. Thank you, Allison, for doing a wonderful job. My pleasure, David. Thank you. And I wanted to thank her also for what she said at the October the 7th commemorative event last week. I will never forget the statements Allison read out and the image of all those bodies of women and girls killed on that dreadful day, and how not one body was in a fit state to be shown to their parents. That's true, Liam. Not one, okay? What those bastards did to those lovely young women. That, says David, and the words of Ellie Sharabi, will echo in my mind always as a reminder of the evil that was perpetrated on Israelis. And I'm sure many other ordinary Brits who feel a duty to stand with the people of Israel and their Jewish brothers and sisters here in Britain feel the same. I'm left thinking how amazing Israelis have proved in coming together to fight against the monstrous cruelty they suffered on the 7th of October. What strengths they have shown, both as a society and as individuals like Ellie Sharabi. Israel is strong and will survive. But it is our society and others in the liberal West I fear for more. As Ellie made clear in Allison's interview, Islamist ideology threatens us all, yet we show remarkable little courage in pushing back against a cancer that seems to be eating us from within. After 7/7 bombings, Manchester Arena, London Bridge attacks, Borough Market, God knows how many other failed jihadi attacks, I only hope that the anti-Semitic murders in Manchester on Yom Kippur will finally wake us all up to the implacable hatred jihadism poses to Jews and to all of us. Thank you again for the wonderful interview with Ellie and for the unmissable Planet Normal podcast with Liam. All best wishes, David. Thank you, David. That's very kind.
This is John. An email for Liam, writes John. I've been running a small engineering consultancy specialising in flood risk and drainage for residential development and have been doing so over 20 years. During that time, we've provided support to developers in negotiating the increasingly more tortuous planning process, as layer on layer of information, often repetitive, is sought by the authorities and quite frankly appears no more than a mechanism to delay decision-making. In our experience, this is a key factor in constraining the industry's ability to deliver homes. Nonetheless, we appear to have achieved at least some degree of equilibrium in dealing with the process and satisfying the guidelines and standards, both national and local, which apply to our areas of expertise. However, says John, 2 weeks ago, we were alerted to the publication without any warning to the industry of a new government standard for sustainable drainage systems to be adopted immediately without any transitional provision. These standards contain a number of issues, including a fundamental contradiction with the long-since established approach, which forms the very basis of all the other standards which we're expected to comply with. They demonstrate a dismaying lack of understanding of the planning and development process and can only serve to further slow down the delivery of housing, so entirely contrary to the very aspirations of the government. I can only conclude, says John, that the standards were prepared without any input from those on the ground who are actually involved in the process. But hey, what's new? Thanks both of you for all your hard, informed and important work. Regards, John. And this is from Malcolm. Course you can, Malcolm. Sorry, I have to say that. Whenever I can refer to that Vicks Sinex nasal spray advert, I shall do so without fear or favour. Sorry, Malcolm.
Sorry, Malcolm.
Oh, Mum, I can't do my exams with a blocked up nose. Of course you can, Malcolm. This is about Kemi Badenoch's conference speech. She's always been the most intelligent of our political leaders, says Malcolm. Her speech confirmed her as being clearly in that position. Some of us have been critical of her for failing to make the political weather and not being known by the public. She and her party were done and irrelevant. Her political opponents have joyfully and far too quickly, foolishly asserted. From here on, says Malcolm, she'll be making the political weather, I suggest, and she'll become very well known if those in the media have any sense. Big assumption. Watch this space, says Malcolm. I've no doubt that in one 60-minute speech, she's inspired every Tory candidate in the land for next year's elections and revitalised her party. She has me anyway, and I'm excited, which makes a very welcome change. Good for you, Malcolm.
And this is from Ruth, writing about something that really bothered me this week, Liam. I'm becoming concerned, says Ruth, about the creeping nature of Sharia views and rules in this country. I've just heard about the ban on girls over 12 years taking part in an East London charity park run. This needs to be addressed by our laws and immediately. They should not be allowed to get away with it. Our tolerance is destroying us. Women fought so long and so hard for our rights in our country. Last week, my daughter-in-law, who is a teacher, told me about a conversation at the school gate between a Muslim mother and an English, as far as we know, mum. They both agreed that homosexuality was outrageous and that it was a waste of time teaching girls algebra. Rather, you should teach them how to run a home. These views were not challenged at the time, says Ruth, and one can only assume that the English mother was not very bright or a bit intimidated. However, as we have seen, there are always useful idiots who stand aside and allow these appalling views to fester. This occurred in an area where the indigenous population are still in the majority and might be called middle class. It is horribly insidious. We really need our leaders to step up here and outlaw Sharia laws and courts. But when have we ever been protected? Yours in desperation, Ruth. I should say, Liam, don't know if you saw this story. Absolutely outrageous. And these people do not get to be in our country and ban teenage girls and young women from taking part in a public event because of presumably they're supposed to be more modest. And we are seeing this. And in answer to what Ruth said, if the government, given how pusillanimous and Starmer pushing ahead with a definition of Islamophobia, which would prevent you and me and Ruth and millions like us saying you will not treat young British women in our country like that. No, as Ruth said, our grandmothers, our mothers, they fought hard so that young, girls would have equal education and equal treatment. And we're not going to stand by and watch a definition come in which would prevent any criticism of things which need to be called out.
Every now and then, Allison, you read something or you listen to somebody speaking and a single, often short sentence punches through. And I'm not sure if Ruth is a professional writer. She can certainly write beautifully. Our tolerance is destroying us. What a fantastic sentence. What an effective piece of communication. So much meaning in that. And that will resonate with many of our listeners. And on that bombshell, That's it from Planet Normal. Wesley leave our Sanctuary of Sweet Reason, our flying refuge of reason and views. Email of the week. It's my turn because I haven't been here for ages. And it is to Ruth, a really interesting email. So please send us an email with mug winner in the subject heading, Ruth, and your postal address, and we'll send you that much coveted Planet Normal mug.
And just to remind you again about the Planet Normal live event coming this weekend on Sunday at 11 a.m, we'll be recording a special edition of Planet Normal at the brilliant Battle of Ideas at Church House in central London. I believe some tickets are still available through the festival website, battleofideas, all one word, .org.uk. And there is a Planet Normal discount. So just use the word planet when buying tickets and you'll get a 20% discount. It's not just us. There are loads of fantastic events. And do come up. I haven't told Halligan this because he's been away, but I did an event the other day and a lovely Planet Normal listener came up. And unfortunately, I had become overcome by hunger, not having eaten anything all day. So I was half the way through a jammy donut. And this lady came up to me and she said, "How's the weight loss contest with Liam going?" So I said, "I don't normally eat donuts." She said, "I believe you." So anyway, but do come up and don't catch me eating a donut. But we've got fantastic guests, haven't we, on Sunday, Liam?
We have. It's a specially extended live edition. It starts at 11 a.m. on Sunday. We're interviewing the Labour peer, Maurice Glassman, Lord Glassman, the founder of the so-called Blue Labour movement of party traditionalists, a powerful grouping that often disagrees with leader Keir Starmer and Labour's so-called progressive wing.
And we will also be joined by the absolutely brilliant Tracy Edwards, who was a 24-year-old cook on charter boats, became the skipper of the first ever all-female crew to enter the Whitbread round the world yacht race in 1989. And on Liam's recommendation, I just watched Maiden, which is Tracy's story, the story of that unbelievable voyage. It's on Amazon Prime and it's absolutely thrilling. Tracy's a fabulous lady and she's got lots of views on girls and equality. I'm sure Tracy will have some views on young women in East London fun runs not being allowed to take part because of modesty reasons.
Indeed. I'm completely starstruck by Tracy Edwards. I have to say, she's sort of like the Sharon Davis of the open sea.
She is. She is. You like feisty women near water, don't you, co-pilot?
That is a BAFTA-nominated documentary that Allison mentioned, Maiden. It's so moving. It's such a powerful story. If you've enjoyed this episode of Planet Normal, please subscribe, leave a review and rating wherever you listen. Thanks finally to our producers Cass Ho, James Hodgson and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week or until Sunday, if you're coming to the Battle of Ideas, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.